When it comes to gaming landmarks, the Metal Gear Solid series is possibly the most cherished and important franchises in the stealth genre. While Konami has done jack all in 10 years, outside of Delta coming out soon, the series is well regarded by fans and made a whole bunch of memes online. While each game has their own identity and gimmicks, the most profound element of the franchise is its tight and enriching story, a half-decade-long drama in regards to nuclear war featuring provoking tales, starting from a US war hero defecting to the Soviets to protect the people that she loved, to the post-modern dystopia of 2014 where war is a frequent occurrence and everyone is neutered by militaristic companies all working under one umbrella. And because of the loyalship and continuity from franchise creator Hideo Kojima, there is a clear distinction in the Metal Gear Saga between what is canon and what is non-canon. Well, except for two oddities. 2004's Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes, and 2006's Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops. These two titles have their fair share of controversy within the fandom, and while Twin Snakes is a remake, majority of the fans prefer to play the polygonal and grounded PlayStation 1 original version when it comes to playing the Metal Gear Saga from start to finish, often ignoring Portable Ops. Despite these two games being released on different hardware that are locked to those systems, I consider these two peas in a pod being underappreciated titles in the Metal Gear series that I believe deserve a fair shot at being canon for several reasons. Let's start with the easier pick, Portable Ops. Most fans, Kojima included, usually gloss over Portable Ops, where, in all fairness, this game is the missing link between Snake Eater and Peace Walker. The downside is that it's locked behind the PSP, with the only other way to play it is through the PS Vita shop. This game was not a part of the HD or Legacy collections back on the PS3, and there's an obvious reason for which we will get into later. But that being said, it is still a solid, no pun intended, installment in the series. I won't go over the story to the game, but the basic gist is that Big Boss has to prove to the world that he is not affiliated with the corrupted Fox unit by building a small army to take down the boss of said unit, Gene. Since this is a PSP game from 2006, it plays just fine. It heavily borrows the controls from Snake Eater, and I'd say that the game's controls to handheld are good enough. Plus the perks recruited units have make the game a lot more interesting. But I'm not here to talk about the gameplay, I'm here to talk about the lore and the game's eventual successor. The San Geronimo incident is, in my opinion, the Attack of the Clones of the Metal Gear series, a prequel title that features characters that would appear later on in the timeline. It further plants the seeds of what we would see later on in the Solid series, and of course, its whole gimmick is having one identical army fight another identical army. But unlike the massive slog that is Episode 2, Portable Ops' story is pretty good. Character motives are straightforward but interesting, and we see a further dark turn for Big Boss before it gets to the anime silliness of Peace Walker. This game was originally made to be canon in mind, almost treated as supplementary material for MGS4, even being featured briefly in that game. The game's story does not contradict with the fact that Fox is disbanded in 1970, Big Boss finding Foxhound in 1971, or that the Les Enfants project starting in 1972. But around the 2010s, Kojima began to consider the events of the game non-canon, or at the very least, happening in a different way in the Metal Gear Saga. In other words, any game that Kojima did not direct, including those where he was the producer, such as Portable Ops, are considered non-canon. Hell, there's a moment early on in Peace Walker where Kaz throws some shade at the San Geronimo incident, saying all of that crap is now behind them. My personal theory, and I'm almost certain I'm not the only one who thought of this, is that Kojima wanted Peace Walker to be Portable Ops' replacement in the timeline. Both games were released on the PSP, but Peace Walker came out near the end of that console's life, and is full of rich content that Portable Ops lacks, only being elevated further with it getting an HD remaster with refined controls and the pure utter genius that is transferring. Peace Walker has more details and cutscenes, and overall a cleaner presentation than Portable Ops, even featuring 3D cutscenes. The key comparison is that both games have similar gameplay mechanics and even story beats. For starters, most people would rather play Peace Walker since Portable Ops has a more redundant and repetitive recruitment system, giving the game a slow start. whereas in Peace Walker, you could use the Fulton system and instantly recruit units. On top of that, Peace Walker uses Metal Gear Solid 4's more modern third-person shooting controls, making it more accessible to play. Oh, and it also features co-op and a mission-based progression system, so there's that too. Portable Ops features more bare-bones gameplay, where you travel to the same 5 to 6 maps while the plot occasionally progresses along the way. But don't let that discourage you. The game almost has a unique tick to it. You'd be checking one map while the sent out squads investigate another map and come back with goods and intel is really engaging. And as you gather more soldiers to the team, you can potentially unlock extra characters, be it by New Game Plus, or by playing normally, or by using passwords, some of which are characters from Snake Eater. Whether or not the canonicity of these characters being in San Geronimo is up to the masses, no. But I find somewhat joy to see Paramedic, a bright and cheery nurse who is a film connoisseur, running around a highly militarized area and blowing up a comms tower. Another thing Portable Ops has going for is the bosses. Peace Walker has repetitive boss fights that go on for way too long because every boss fight has an absurd amount of health, though admittedly the final boss fight is pretty hype. Portable Ops has a variety of bosses throughout its linear structure. Of course, there's fighting a Metal Gear, but the boss fights with Python, both Null Fights, Cunningham, and Gene are pretty engaging. Heck, if you take out Python non-lethally, he will join your team free of charge. Of course, it's not the same as pulling out motherboard pieces in order to strengthen Zeke and Peace Walker, but hey, you don't have to grind the same 2 to 3 boss fights over and over again. And if I have to tip the scale in favor to Portable Ops, it has a much straightforward endgame, unlike in Peace Walker, where you have to find Zadornov in 7 different locations, make sure certain departments in Mother Base are at a certain rank, and have Metal Gear Zeke be fully operational and perform missions, all just so you could unlock the true ending. In Portable Ops, you fight Gene and you're done. But the biggest comparison to Peace Walker is not in the gameplay, but in the story. Big Boss in Central America, recruiting a smaller army from scratch and fighting a bigger organization to prevent nuclear war while having some connections to Operation Snake Eater. Additionally, Big Boss is accompanied by a partner who would later help Solid Snake, and by the end of the game, he starts setting in motion the idea to build an army without borders, which becomes the foundations to Outer Heaven. And an even crazier conspiratorial connection comes from the English voice cast. I know that Kojima doesn't have direct control over the dubs for his games, but if you go on his Twitter, he absolutely loves American cinema. He puts references to American movies in his games all the time, and he has been working alongside Western actors and directors in recent years. So it becomes really conspicuous when Peace Walker not only brings back voice actors from Portable Ops, but also playing similar roles. Steve Blum plays Gene in Portable Ops, who commands an entire army by the power of his voice, and plans on making a false flag nuke attack. And in Peace Walker, he's playing Zadornov, the secret mastermind, who also plans on making a false flag nuke attack. Tara Strong plays a teenage girl in both games that initially helps Big Boss, but is revealed to be a two-sided, in Portable Ops literally, spy that pilots a Metal Gear that Big Boss fights. Maybe it was a budget thing where the recording studio could only use the same voice actors for convenience, but in a series like Metal Gear, where retcons are so common, I find it hard to believe that it was a coincidence. Speaking of retcons, this leads into the final point. People who say that Portable Ops was retconned and later replaced by Peace Walker was that in the Metal Gear Saga, Portable Ops would add more retcons to the lore. That game ends with Big Boss having all the money in the world to start his independent army, and then 4 years later, he's with Kaz scraping funds until Zadornov comes knocking on their door. Where did all of Gene's money go? There's 2 possible theories. 1. The government confiscated the money from Big Boss when returning to America. It's never stated what happened to the money, but considering that the government has already painted a target on Big Boss's back by Snake Eater, Foxhounds is formed 1 year later, the Patriots starting up, followed by the Les Infanteries project starting, I'm pretty sure we could guess what happened to Gene's money. And theory number 2, it's just a simple retcon. Or at the very least, the money wasn't a lot as Gene made it out to be, and that Big Boss used what was there for MSF. But in all honesty, I never got the impression that Big Boss did nothing for 10 years in between the 2 games and somehow found a small loner army. I highly doubt that. Another retcon in Portable Ops is that Sokolov is alive. To me, I never got the impression that Sokolov died during Snake Eater. First off, it happens off screen, and we only get to hear Volgin's confirmation. Second, Volgin is too headstrong and abrasive. He will believe Big Boss is dead using the fake death pill, and fall for the Rykov mask during his boss fight. Third, this is Metal Gear. Characters can die and come back like it's no big deal. So yeah, the retcons is something that I have to disagree with. Having this middle adventure to the Big Boss trilogy makes the story more tighter and connected. Gene's whole thing was about creating an independent army, an army's heaven, by using the power of his voice alone, easily able to manipulate his soldiers to kill one another through the power of suggestion, indicating that language is a powerful tool when in the right hands. That doesn't sound too different to what Skullface wanted with the vocal parasites in Phantom Pain, now does it? Showing the power of language and eradicating it for total domination. I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it, but I do believe Portable Ops is a necessary game to the series' timeline. Again, it does suck that it's locked to the PSP, as well as its enhanced version, Portable Ops Plus, which doesn't even include the main game. I only wish that we get an HD treatment of the game whenever the second volume of the Master Collection is announced. Hey, if the NES games got a chance, why not Portable Ops? Okay, that was one game down. But now I get to defend what is considered to be the most controversial remake of the 2000s. Okay, second controversial. Okay, it's Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. When it comes to the Metal Gear Saga as a whole, the series typically uses the original game as the go-to source for the Shadow Moses incident, which always seemed strange. Whenever a remake of a franchise's first game comes out, subsequent titles use the remake as a reference for the first game rather than the original. That's not the case with Metal Gear. The closest we got to the series considering both the original and remake as respectable to one another was in Metal Gear Solid 4, but we'll get to why shortly. For now, I would like to debunk some reasons for why Twin Snakes is often regarded as the inferior way to play Metal Gear Solid 1. Oh, and also, just a clarification, whenever I show footage of the codec screen in blue, that's actually Twin Snakes. For some reason, Dolphin didn't render the codec screens to be in black, so every time you see the codec in blue, it's Twin Snakes, and in black, it's the original. For starters, Twin Snakes is heavily running on the same engine as Metal Gear Solid 2, a game that featured more rich and complex controls than in the first game, and nuanced mechanics that the PlayStation 1 could not process. The flaw is that the Twin Snakes map and level design is almost a faithful recreation to that of the PlayStation release. And because of that, the game was never meant to include first-person aiming, resulting in the first-person mode to break the game in two. In fact, the Japan-only integral version of the original game features a first-person view mode after beating it. This allows Snake to move around and shoot in first person. While this feature clearly breaks the game, it acts as an extra bonus mode. Unlike the Twin Snakes, where switching to first person is a part of the actual game. So on paper, that makes the remake have a heavy flaw in the gameplay department. Actually, no. While the remake uses Sons of Liberty's controls, it also carries over that game's gameplay mechanics. Aside from non-lethal weapons to take out bosses and enemies, Snake can walk while crouching when pressed against walls, peek his head or aim when pressed, hang on ledges, roll while running, attack while in the first person, hold up enemies, shoot enemy arms, shoot enemy radios, hide in lockers, place unconscious enemies in lockers, placing books on the floor to distract enemies, bird poop, and punching enemies in the balls to instantly knock them out. In other words, Snake has more mobility than he did in the original. But the remake does make an attempt to balance out the difficulty using Metal Gear Solid 2's more advanced AI. More guards and security cameras are placed throughout the game. The caution phase adds more guards even after the alert and evasion phase have been cleared. If Snake is low on health, the bar will turn orange and gradually decrease over time, resulting in Snake bleeding. This can be resolved by crouching to heal or use bandages. Enemy reinforcements will carry riot shields, adding a further penalty of getting caught. Enemies will perform room checks during evasions. Enemies will also perform status reports in certain areas, and if they're knocked out, HQ will inquire about their absence. If there's one word that I would like to describe why I think the Twin Snakes is the better game, it's accessibility. Not as in accessibility in the game's availability, because there's only one option, but in terms of gameplay. One of the biggest flaws with the remake is that the first-person mode trivializes most of the boss fights, from headhunting Ocelot in 3 rounds to brute force headshots on Raven. The thing that most people tend to forget is that the original methods of beating the bosses are still here. You can choose to chase Ocelot around the room during his boss fight. Much like the first-person method, this strategy is easy, but it takes longer. In my opinion, shooting the 2 guards during the tank fight in first person is actually harder, because the tank moves around. Yeah, you can use the claymores to stop the tracks, but it's just easier to use the PlayStation 1 grenade trick. Still to this day, I have no clue how you are supposed to fight Metal Gear Rex in the original without cheesing it in the second phase. However, in Twin Snakes, thanks to Snake's more agile ability, I have a fair fight with Rex. Unlike in the original, where dying during Phase 2 takes you back to Phase 1, and being stuck listening to
I'm good. I can't do it, I can't do it. I can't.
Both the proper and Nikita tactics for the second Sniper Wolf fight is still here. And really, every other boss fight is just how it was back in the original. It's just that most people get a bad impression with the Ocelot fight being trivialized to 3 trank shots. If I do have to make one complaint, the final section in the Grey Fox fight has been removed, where he goes apeshit and emits a shockwave. That was relegated to a cutscene in the remake. Also in the original, you still have to kick Liquid off Rex, even though the fight is already over, whereas again in Twin Snakes, that's also a cutscene. However, the timer during the boss fight actually starts at 3 minutes, whereas in the original, you still have to wait 30 seconds until you regain control of Snake, giving you less time to beat Liquid on the first try. Granted, you do get some of that time back after a game over, but considering I don't have the footage of me beating Liquid on PS1 because I was getting frustrated, yeah, you can see why I prefer the fight on GameCube. Another point people tend to complain with Twin Snakes is in the music department. Every song from the original has been replaced with a more orchestral score. And while the original game's soundtrack is iconic in its own right, I can't help but also enjoy the music in Twin Snakes, making the environments more industrialized and more intense whenever there's an alert phase. Heck, the game gives each boss battle their own theme, something lacking in the original, and the themes reflect each character. Ocelot has a western twirl in his theme, the tribal elements of Raven's theme, the eastern influence for Grey Fox's theme, and of course, Mantis's hymn gets a techno remix during his boss fight. And while the game lacks the original Metal Gear Solid theme, parts and pieces can be heard throughout the game, mainly during the escape sequence. This might be a musical preference, but I just think the music in Twin Snakes is somewhat decent. Additionally, some of the changes in the Twin Snakes feel more like quality of life improvements over the original. If I must make people remove their nostalgia glasses, I'm going to be the first to admit that some of the gameplay elements from Metal Gear Solid do not age well, and most of it is a carryover from the MSX games back in the late 80s and early 90s. These archaic mechanics were removed in Metal Gear Solid 2, and Twin Snakes carries those over as well. For starters, I always hate how much of an inconvenience it is to have the key card held in the item selection in order to open doors, something that 2 removes entirely. I know this was a carryover from the MSX games, where doors won't open unless you have the specific key card held in the inventory. Metal Gear 2 simplifies the key cards to compact cards found throughout the game, and Solid simplifies it even further to just 1 key card that's level increases as the story progresses. But as someone who has played these series so many times, it gets annoying that I try to leave a room only to forget that I don't have the key card equipped, cycling through my items just to find it. Twin Snakes cuts the bullshit and opens doors that Snake could only access at the moment, which helps that you don't have to constantly switch back and forth between the key card and the gas mask in toxic rooms. In the original, after beating a boss, Snake's health gradually increases and occasionally can hold more quantities of ammo and items. This too was omitted from Twin Snakes, where Snake starts off with a full health bar and being able to hold 5 rations from the get-go. A lot of people hate this change since it automatically makes the game easier. But with the more advanced AI and higher enemy placement, I think having 5 rations right away gives the game a fair start. The progression system is yet another carryover from the first MSX game, with Metal Gear 2 having a similar progression system as in Solid. However, in the first game, the progression comes with your rank. The more hostages you rescue, the higher Snake's rank is, which allows him to have more health and ammo. But in that game, rank was a necessity. If a hostage is accidentally killed, Snake's rank goes down, as well as those perks. And you're going to need all of the health, rations, and plastic explosives if you want to get through the electrical paneled floor that you can't disarm, followed by the Metal Gear fight in the first game. Metal Gear 2 removes the ranks and just has the health bar and ammo count go up after each boss fight, but I could let that slide because this was a PC game in the 90s. Whereas in Solid, there is no reason for Snake to randomly increase his health and weapon count throughout the game if there's no penalty for being reckless with it. Besides, do you really need all of those grenades just to get through the first Metal Gear Solid? Twin Snakes removes the progression system, but compensates by giving each weapon a reasonable amount of ammo. Taking items from guards in the original is a much riskier process, where you either have to stealthily choke them out or a suppressed SOCOM if you need rations or ammo. Once again, another carryover from the MSX games. But if you want that illustrious Foxhounds or Big Boss rank, your kill count needs to be lower than 20. Twin Snakes alleviates that struggle thanks to tranquilizing enemies and shaking them down for items. In the original, there were times where I choked out a guard and the alert phase still triggered. In Twin Snakes, enemies and bosses drop dog tags, which was carried over from Metal Gear Solid 2. But personally, I don't see a purpose for them being here. The whole thing about the dog tags in 2 was that it was a story narrative. Raiden throwing away the player's dog tags indicate that he is now free from the player's control. Until in Metal Gear Rising, where he's controlled by the player again, but don't tell him that. Most people say that using non-lethal weapons break the Twin Snakes, but in this playthrough, I noticed in most areas, especially during boss fights and set pieces, more times than not, I was getting ammo for lethal weapons. So it's not like the game is constantly encouraging you to always use the M9. Most people tend to complain that the voice acting in the game is a lot more stilted and dry compared to the engaging voice acting in the original. But I think it's because most of the voice actors were already comfortable with their characters by the time the remake came out. There's a reason why MGS4 uses the audio from this game unlike in the original. Well, for one, the voice actors aren't recording their lines in a tunnel, but two, the voice acting in the remake ties into the continuity. People hate how both Mei Ling and Naomi in the remake dropped their accents. Yet Mei Ling was born and raised in America, and Naomi was never British to begin with. Their accents didn't return in Metal Gear Solid 4 anyway, so it is safe to assume that the retcon was necessary to fit into continuity. Mei Ling does have her Chinese accent in Metal Gear Solid 2 during her cameo, but it's an Easter egg where you have to constantly save throughout the tanker incident that a regular player would not see unless they know about it. And if you're upset that I think this was a good retcon, Master Miller was depicted as an Asian with black hair in the original portraits for Metal Gear 2. Then, after Metal Gear Solid, he was retconned to look more similar in his subsequent appearances as a retcon. I'm just saying, I hear nobody complain about that retcon. The only person that does not reprise their role was Greg Eagles playing Grey Fox. It's probably because his Grey Fox sounded a bit too much like his DARPA chief, so Rob Paulsen is playing the ninja. In my opinion, I think he did a good job of making Frank Yeager his own. Plus, with Liquid being played by Cam Clark, Grey Fox's death could be juxtaposed to the 1987 Ninja Turtles, where Leonardo kills Raphael. Or 2012 Donatello. Your choice. But now, I have saved the most common complaint about the Twin Snakes for last. That's right, the newly choreographed cutscenes in the remake's presentation. Starting with the briefing. In the original, the briefing was fixed images of Snake talking to Campbell, but in the Twin Snakes, These conversations use 3D models with the option to freely move and change camera angles. I can see why the original is so distinct, like the player is watching a top secret meeting, whereas the remake looks like you're watching the security cameras of a doctor's office. And some of the models try way too hard to match up with the dialogue.
Sounds like a spy movie.
But there's one moment where, I shit you not, where Snake gets up in Campbell's face and starts pushing him around, and it looks like two babies fighting. And yet, I still will prefer the Twin Snakes briefing, because the original looks like shit. Snake looks blonde in the tapes, and it's just not engaging as the remake for all of its stupid and over-exaggerated shortcomings. But the wackiness only increases throughout the game, where most people jokingly call the Twin Snakes the Matrix. Ironic because the game's cutscenes were directed by a Japanese filmmaker. These cutscenes have so many bullet time, slow motion shots, and of course, crazy backflips. Some people have tried to justify the new presentation as either Otacon's retelling of the events of Shadow Moses, since as we all know,
it's like one of my Japanese animes,
or that the Twin Snakes was a simulated version of the Shadow Moses incident that Raiden experienced during his training alongside the events of Ghost Babel, which was also simulated based on the evidence that the player of Ghost Babel is named Jack, which is also Raiden's name. And while both could be reasonable to justify, I think the idea of Solid Snake doing crazy backflips, dodging bullets, jumping on a moving missile to fire another missile, and attempting to attack Metal Gear Rex head-on is actually kind of part of his character. Think about it. Snake is known as a legendary soldier, so basically being a Neo is not entirely out of the question. And on top of that, Snake is a super soldier clone of Big Boss, the same man who survived a nuclear explosion 10 miles away. Of course he's going to be more agile and reflexive than a normal human being. All I'm saying is, I never see anyone complain that Leon does all of these super cool moves in the original Resident Evil 4, and he was trained by the government, so Snake should get a free pass too. In fact, the new cinematography is a huge benefit for characters like Grey Fox, where he goes full anime mode in his cutscenes. But even still, most people hate the cutscenes, since it makes the Shadow Moses incident less serious. After all, Metal Gear Solid is a serious franchise. And I'm sorry, but what the hell are you talking about? Yes, the themes of nuclear war and the erasure of identity are serious themes that spreads throughout the series. But on the flip side, Metal Gear has always had silly moments in almost every game in the franchise. A game like Peace Walker, which tells the story of nuclear deterrence through peace during the height of the Cold War, and features one of the most beautiful moments in the series. And yet this is the same game where you can eat a bag of Doritos, a can of Mountain Dew, and a bottle of Axe body spray in 1974 no less, while fighting Rathalos from Monster Hunter. Oh, and also go on a date with a woman pretending to be 16, as well as your partner wearing Speedos. Metal Gear Solid 4 is supposed to be set in this dystopia where war is the norm, and yet Snake is running around with a Gen 1 iPod, and two characters talk about getting married while being shot at. Ever since the beginning in Metal Gear Solid, we have had a character who chronically shits himself, and Kojima wrote that into a plot point as one of the big climaxes that happens in MGS4. And lest we forget, this game features a boss who reads your memory card and calls you out on playing other Konami games.
You like Castlevania, don't you?
I'm sorry, how is Twin Snakes way too silly to be considered on par with the original, let alone the rest of the series? And I could go on and on and on about all of the other stupid shit that happens in the other games, looking at you, Rising, but I think I made my point clear. Twin Snakes' cutscenes are tonally in sync with the rest of the series in terms of heightened reality, and with the Matrix-like cinematography, it really feels like you're watching a big-budget action movie. And isn't that a common complaint with the Metal Gear series? Super long cutscenes that feel like you're watching a movie rather than a game? But to close things off, I personally love the final scene where Liquid dies from Fox Die in the remake. In the original, Snake and Meryl, or Otacon, are stuck under the Jeep, and just at the last second, Liquid succumbs to Fox Die. However, in the remake, there's an extra beat where Liquid has a stare down with Snake before dying again. Most people hate this change since the tension from the original is already gone, but it makes sense since Snake is fine, whereas Liquid got beat up, fell down several stories, and got shot Lord knows how many times. And besides, the remake is called Twin Snakes, so there's a lot more emphasis between the protagonist and the antagonist. And all of the action-focused cutscenes is the frosting to an already spectacular story. I mean, it literally is a remake of the first game, so there are no alterations to the major story beats. My final point as to liking Twin Snakes more than the original goes back to the statement of accessibility. Twin Snakes gives you a choice on how you want to play the game. Things like getting the M9 in the cavern and trivializing the opening sequence is an option. You can choose to get it, or wait until the helipad where you could get it underneath the truck that holds the SOCOM. During the infrared segment, you could choose to use cigarettes or night vision goggles to see the wires, or you could disable the sensors in first person. And this choice helps a lot with the backtracking. You can go get the PGS-1 in the warehouse all the way back in the first building, or head over to the second building and grab the PGS-1T and shave off time on the backtracking. In the second comms building, you could still use chaff grenades to temporarily disable the armed security cameras, which you may not have enough to disable all of them when going up and down the staircases, or switch to first person and permanently disable the cameras from afar. But this choice can be more important when warming and cooling the PAL card. You could still go to the freezer room or the boiler room and manually change the temperature of the PAL card. Or, in Rex's hangar, by perfectly timing a ledge grab when falling, you can shoot hot and cold pipes to automatically warm and cool the PAL card. This is another carryover from Metal Gear 2, where a key item changes in different temperatures. But in Twin Snakes, you get an alternative way to perform story-based sequences. It gives players the choice to do things one way or another, and by not restricting them to using the new way. Though the newer method saves a lot of time, especially with Rex's hangar being loaded all at once, unlike the original game where each floor is loaded one at a time. This sense of choice in a remake reminds me of another remake from 2004. Yeah, I'm comparing Twin Snakes to Zero Mission. It's my video. Metroid Zero Mission is a remake to the original 1986 release of the first Metroid title. In the remake, players have the choice of getting the Varia suit or not, having the option to fight Ridley before Kraid, following the Chozo statue markers, or exploring Zebes on their own, and Samus being more flexible to control than in the original. That's not to say that the Twin Snakes is on par with Zero Mission. That game adds a brand new location to explore, more boss fights, an extra epilogue segment, and making the game entirely irrelevant. But the elements of how you want to play the game makes the remake more accessible to play, especially for newcomers. And in my opinion, that is something that the Twin Snakes also accomplishes. That being said, Twin Snakes does have some downsides on a gameplay scale. The remake doesn't feature the VR missions from the original, a collection of training missions that were so fun that Konami made a separate game based off of them. Silicon Knights, the main programmers for the remake, said that it was a time constraint for their inclusion, but I also think that it's because of hardware limitations, especially when changing the disc happens right before you enter the comms tower, whereas in the original, changing the discs happen after the second fight with Sniper Wolf. But on the flip side, the game does feature a boss rush mode that was carried over from Metal Gear Solid 2, so it's not like the game is totally bare bones and content. So why won't Konami re-release the Twin Snakes, or at least acknowledge it? Well, I think it's the same reason why Bayonetta 2 or 3 will never be released outside of a Nintendo console. Twin Snakes is pretty much a second-party Nintendo game. Kojima and Miyamoto supervised the game's development, and trying to release the game on Xbox, PlayStation, or Steam is going to take a lot more than just removing the Mario, Yoshi, and GameCube models from the game. It's not like you can remove Otacon's comment about Metal Gear Solid 4 running on a Blu-ray disc. Nintendo's presence in Twin Snakes is very well coded in the game's DNA. and that's why the series usually recognizes the original game more than its remake. MGS4's Flashback uses the original game visually since 2008 was the 10-year anniversary of that game. Ground Zero's Deja Vu mission uses the original game and assets, since it would be weird if they referenced a Nintendo title when celebrating the legacy of a PlayStation game. And with the remake being locked behind a console that is over 20 years old, Twin Snakes will probably never see the light of day again. But I could see some methods for Nintendo to re-release it. It could be an exclusive title for the Nintendo version of the Master Collection Volume 2. I can also see an HD remaster that can be sold on its own exclusively to the Nintendo eShop, since a lot of games from around that time period have recently been getting that treatment. Or if the rumored GameCube Online app comes to either the Switch or Switch 2, Nintendo could very well re-release both Twin Snakes and Silicon Knights' previous game, Eternal Darkness, as titles to their mature content of that app. In any case, I really hope Twin Snakes does get a second chance in one way or another. Maybe if it does, a new generation of fans could look back and appreciate that, while different from the original, can stand on its own. And so, those were my defenses on the two overshadowed and neglected games in the Metal Gear canon. I hope that Konami gives them a second chance, since in a way, they are a part of the Metal Gear legacy, portable ops being the foundation of the gameplay mechanics that would later be seen in Peace Walker and even in Phantom Pain. And if it's possible, Nintendo could come to an understanding with Konami to bring back Twin Snakes in one way or another. We have seen the impossible become the possible with Nintendo partnering with other companies. And as someone who has played Twin Snakes first, I will admit that, I always feel like the game gets a bad rep online because it's not the original. It fails as a remake, when it never was meant to be a replacement. Twin Snakes, as it is an alternative, a more accessible way to play the first game. It was meant to be Nintendo's proper first Metal Gear entry outside of the non-canon NES games and Ghost Babel for the Game Boy Color. Why else did Snake become the first third-person character to appear in Smash Bros. When Metal Gear is predominantly a PlayStation series? I personally think that Twin Snakes had something to do with it, with Nintendo and Konami still having a somewhat good relationship in 2007. When I first got into this series as an 11-year-old, I had no reason to not buy the original Metal Gear Solid through the PSN store. A couple of months prior, I bought the original Resident Evil trilogy on the PSN store. I could have done the same thing with MGS. But instead, I went on Amazon and I bought Twin Snakes. I don't know what caused me to buy it, but I wanted to give the game a chance. So you could tell that I do have a soft spot for this game because it was my first exposure to the original title. Of course, this game is not perfect. No game is perfect. And nobody should consider this game to be the definitive way to play MGS1. It's just an alternative. Yeah, I know the marketing for this game said it was supposed to be the definitive way, but marketing is always deceitful. So, if you have the resources, piracy, or method of playing these games, give them a go, you will not be disappointed. But with all of that said, if you learned something new, or maybe changed your perception about these games, make sure you subscribe, since I also occasionally do other video essays besides my normal Shareverse content. Until then, I'm AJ, and I don't know.
Show's over.